Hi, and welcome to today's Engaging for Missouri webinar. I'm Alice Roach from the Division of Applied Social Sciences at the University of Missouri, and I'll be your webinar host. With this webinar series, we intend to facilitate a discussion focused on research-based insights that leaders like you can apply in your own work to benefit and strengthen the state's agriculture and food system, hospitality sector, and communities. Today we have Dr. Patrick Westhoff joining us to present about the COVID-19 relief bill and its implications for rural America. Before I invite Dr. Westhoff to speak, I wanted to share a few housekeeping items. First, we'll close the webinar today with a question and answer session. Those of you who connected to the webinar via your computer can submit your questions in the chat screen. To open the chat screen, you can just click chat at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you join by phone, then you can email me questions at roacham@missouri.edu. Second, all attendees are muted and may not start their video. Third, if you encounter any technical difficulties, then please let me know by submitting a comment in the chat screen, or you can send me an email at roacham@missouri.edu, and I will try to help you troubleshoot. Fourth, we will make a recorded version of the webinar available to you. You can look for an email from Zoom with a link to that recorded copy in about a day from now. So now we'll transition to the topic of today's webinar, which is titled The COVID-19 Relief Bill, What's in it for Rural America and What Still Needs to be Decided? Presenting on this topic is Dr. Patrick Westhoff, who is the Howard Cowden Professor of Agricultural and Applied Economics, and he's also the Director of MU's Food and Agricultural Policy Research Institute. Thank you, Pat, for being here today. If you could please start your video, then we can begin your presentation.
Well, thanks a lot, Alice, and thanks for everybody else for getting this organized today. We're going to try to give an overview of what's in the bill and what's some things that still need to be decided about where things go forward in terms of providing support to rural America and to the country as a whole. Trying to get to the next slide. There we go. It's a very big bill with a very broad reach. So if you look at the bill as a whole, there's been different media reports about just how big it is. The most common number I've seen in the press is $2 trillion. I've seen 2.1, 2.2, 2.3. The reason that there's not an agreed upon number for the overall value of the bill is that the Congressional Budget Office, the normal scorekeeper for such matters, has not actually scored the bill at this point yet. So it's very striking that we've got a bill this large that has yet to have an official estimate of its cost. How big is $2 trillion? Well, the overall federal budget last year was about $4.4 trillion. That's 45% of that. Another way of thinking about it is it's almost as large as the combined cost of the Social Security, defense spending, and Medicare programs in fiscal year 2019. So it's a lot of money to a lot of people for a lot of purposes. By National Public Radio, there's something like $300 billion available for cash payments to individuals, $1,200 per adult, $500 per child. Those amounts will be phased out for individuals that have income levels over $75,000, or when couples have income over $150,000. By the time you get to $100,000 of individual income, those payments are no longer made. Unemployment insurance, there'll be an increase in eligibility, include the self-employed, gig workers, people like that would normally not be eligible for unemployment insurance. And for the next 4 months, benefits will be boosted by $600 per week above what they would normally be. The Small Business Administration gets $350 billion loans up to $10 million for small businesses. Those loans are forgivable if workers stay employed through June. So while they are labeled as loans, they may work out to be grants when all is said and done, at least for many of these businesses. Big businesses will be eligible for non-refundable tax credits if they agree to keep workers on their payroll. There's money for the airlines and much, much more to benefit large businesses. State and local governments get about $340 billion total between just grants to the states and the ones that are tied specifically to providing certain types of healthcare provisions for people in their state. And finally, hospitals get $100 billion in healthcare support provided as well, and much more in the overall package. Now, focusing on the part of the money that goes to USDA, it's about $49 billion in total that's set aside here. There's $9.5 billion in the orange there for livestock, dairy, specialty crops, and local food systems. $14 billion to replenish the CCC borrowing authority. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Authority that could allow additional payments to farmers as well. There's $15.5 billion for expected increases in SNAP enrollment. Note that that's only because of the expected increase in participation in the program. The bill does not make any changes in the payment rates per month, so the benefit levels themselves are unchanged. What was supposed to be a tightening of some SNAP rules is being postponed at least. And of course, the expectation is with widespread unemployment, a lot of folks with lower incomes, there'll be a big increase in the SNAP rules for the next several months, if not longer. And then finally, there's $8.8 billion for child nutrition programs, including monies to schools to be able to provide food to people not in the school system or who are not attending school because of closures and so on, and then roughly $1 billion for a variety of other purposes. I want to focus now largely on the provisions for the remainder of this brief discussion today, and point out just how unusual some of this is. Farm bills, normally have hundreds of pages in them to set up very specific rules how money is to be spent. So while there's always some discretion at USDA's part about just where the money goes and how it's going to be utilized, there's also very strict rules set up by Congress on how that's supposed to happen. Even when we have a disaster bill, normally there's at least some rules set up about how that money is to be allocated. But on the other hand, this time around, the entire text in the bill for the $9.5 billion reads, as you can see there, $9.5 billion to remain available until expended to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus by providing support for agricultural producers impacted by coronavirus, including producers of specialty crops, producers that supply local food systems, including farmer markets, restaurants, schools, and livestock producers, including dairy producers. That's it. So that is a very high degree of flexibility the secretary will have in deciding how those monies will be spent. And we just talked to some folks at USDA this morning on some work that we're doing, and it's very clear that they're already trying to think about just how they will go about trying to decide who gets how much of this set of funds. So far as $9.5 billion go. So again, if you look at that universe of things that are supposed to be covered, livestock, poultry, dairy, fruits, nuts, vegetables, other specialty crops, and of course the people who supply local food systems, the overall value to farmers of the cash receipts that they would have received in 2019 for selling those products was about $256 billion. So therefore, $9.5 billion would be comparable to about less than 4% of the overall farm level value of those products. So if you're trying to make across the board payments that are exactly proportional to the value of 2019 receipts, it'd be less than 4% of what folks got a year ago. And of course, they won't do that sort of pattern. It'll be more targeted, presumably. So think about how that might play. Let's look at what's happened to prices just in the last couple of months. So it's hard to pick what's the appropriate date of comparison. I just picked kind of randomly February 4th as my point of comparison to where futures markets closed last Friday. So in the case of cattle, the price went from over $120 a hundredweight in February 4th to about $101 per hundredweight on last Friday for the nearby futures close. That's a drop of 16%. You can see the changes there for all the other commodities as well. A bunch of negatives, 6% for hogs, 11% for milk, 11% for corn, 1% for soybeans, 25% for cotton. So a very large drop in cotton. The only two commodities that we've actually seen an increase in futures prices relative to February 4th were wheat and rice. And there's a story there, of course, at least especially in the short run, we've seen people wanting to stock up on staple foods. We've seen countries wanting to stock up on staple foods. So there's actually been a bit of a run up in demand for those very basic products that provide a lot of the calories that people around the world consume. Whereas higher value products like meats in particular, meats and dairy products in particular, have seen some pretty sharp declines in the futures market. Now, cash markets have not always been the same, and obviously what people are paying at the grocery store has been very different than that. How much this will work itself out in the next few days, next few weeks, we're going to have to watch and see how this all plays out. So what about the $14 billion worth of CCC's borrowing authority? So the Commodity Credit Corporation is the account used to make most farm subsidies, such as the Agricultural Risk Coverage Program, the Price Loss Coverage, Conservation Reserve, Dairy Program, Sugar Program. All those are things, and marketing loans, those are all covered by the Commodity Credit Corporation. In 2018 and 2019, the CCC was also used to fund market facilitation payments that compensated farmers for lost trade to countries that imposed retaliatory tariffs on US farm products. Those payments totaled about $14.4 billion in 2019. Those mostly went to field crops, although there were some payments to dairy, to pork, and to almonds and a few other products as well. So the vast majority went to corn, soybean, wheat, cotton producers around the country. So I'm not sure it's a complete coincidence, but you'll note that the 14 billion replenishment is almost equal to the amount of MFP payments made for 2019 losses. So with this replenishment, this will put the overall borrowing authority available to the Secretary back up to its normal level, if you will. And that would create the ability, if the Secretary so chooses, to provide another round of MFP payments or some other emergency program within the authority provided by the CCC Charter Act. The Charter Act gives a lot of authority to the Secretary to do things to offset, as we said, if there's a loss in trade because of trade restrictions, for example, that's something that's something that you can use the Charter Act authority for. It's been used in the past to deal with disasters of various types, and I wouldn't be surprised if this isn't classified as a disaster as well, for purposes of putting together legal authority for what they'll be wanting to do. But there's also some limitations. Part of the reason the MFP program took the form it took last time around was specifically because of what the lawyers told them they could and could not do under the Charter Act authority. So when they put together a new round of payments, whether it's MFP or whether it's something else, they'll have to just make sure that they can pass muster for what is and isn't allowed under the authority of the Charter Act. And finally, just put some things into perspective a little bit here. Want to talk about our outlook for the farm economy. We released here a little earlier in March. Things have changed a lot since we prepared that analysis. That was done based on what we knew back in January. We looked at two scenarios. We're very proud of ourselves for looking at two different scenarios of just our normal one future set of assumptions. Looked at one based on the continuation of trade frictions. So what happens if we retain the retaliatory tariffs that China put in place on U.S. farm products, with those that continued. Then looked at another scenario with one way that the phase one agreement between the United States and China might possibly be implemented, that Seth Meyer would have talked to you about last week. So as you can see, when you look at the overall impact of net cash income in this case on those two different scenarios, in both of those scenarios, we were showing a drop in the measure called net cash income in 2020. The decline was very modest in the case of the phase one scenario. It was more marked in the case of the one where we assumed that the retaliatory tariffs remain in place and were enforced. A different measure, net farm income, would show a little bit different picture with an increase in 2020 under both scenarios. But note that neither of these scenarios anticipated the severity of COVID-19. We weren't really anticipating back in January we'd be where we are today, to put it mildly. So we've done some preliminary work for USDA that's we're not quite ready to talk about in detail yet, but I will tell you right now that we are estimating very large impacts on net cash, net farm income for the ag sector in 2020 out of those scenarios. And in fact, the decline that's likely to occur in farm income because of COVID-19 is probably going to be greater than the difference between those two lines you see on this chart. So therefore, we're talking about lower farm income than even the blue line on this chart, even if the phase one agreement with China bears fruit and we really see increased sales of farm products to China. Just how severe things will be, of course, are very much up in the air right now. There are a lot of things we know about what's happened in markets already. We know the ethanol industry, for example, has been taking a very huge hit as people have been scaling back their driving habits with continued use of 10% blends. That means there's less ethanol being blended in this country. Unless that's offset by more sales overseas, which now currently doesn't seem very likely, we're talking about a major scale back in ethanol production. When ethanol production scales back, that means there's less demand for corn, which drives down corn prices as well. And when you throw in the fact that we almost certainly have weaker demand from the livestock sector, we're looking at a significant drop in overall value what farmers sell in this country. There might be some offsetting cost savings in terms of having reduced feed costs for livestock producers, reduced fuel costs for farmers who have to buy fuel given much lower oil prices we have now. It seems very likely to us that we're talking about a significant drop in farm income this year relative to what would have previously been projected. So I think with that, I'm going to stop and take time for you for questions. If we don't get through all the questions during the course of the next few minutes, you see my email address there. By all means, feel free to drop me a line. I'll be glad to respond as soon as I possibly can. Thank you.
Great, Pat. Thanks so much for that background. We do have a few questions we can go ahead and get started with. One is asking about the direct payment. So for the child credit, is it $500 per child or is it $500 per child per adult?
That's a question I don't know the answer to for sure. I believe it's $500 per child, but that's what I I would defer to someone else who might know more about it than I do.
Sure. We have another question about SNAP. So is there any sense of how SNAP enrollments might increase based on what we learned from SNAP enrollments following the Great Recession?
All right, so we saw a very sharp increase in SNAP enrollments during the Great Recession that more than doubled the overall cost of the program in a very short period of time. Now, some of that increase occurred because, yes, there was at that time an increase in benefit levels as well. But anytime you have a sharp jump in unemployment, you're going to have a big increase in number of people who are eligible for the program. Again, the dollars that have been allocated here are not because of any assumed change in program benefits. It's strictly because of an assumed increase in enrollment that's going to occur.
Okay. I have another question about, you mentioned ethanol facilities and the financial stress that some of those facilities are undergoing right now. And some of the materials that I've been reading, it says that the Commodity Credit Corporation could potentially provide funding to those ethanol facilities. Is that something that the Charter Act would permit?
See, now you're asking me a question, and I'm not a lawyer. My wife, the lawyer, will tell me. And that's it's a very important question. I'm sure there will be attempts made to try to find some way to provide support, but what form those will take, I do not know right now. And certainly that is a legal question in part as to whether or not payments to ethanol are indeed something that can be made under Charter Act authority or under some other authority that USDA has.
Okay, thanks. We have one question from someone who is a sole member of an LLC, but just applied as an S Corp. Can this individual apply for a small business loan?
There's still lots of questions about what the small business loans are going to, what form they're going to take. I don't think the rules are out there just yet. So I wouldn't want to get ahead of myself here and try to guess what the rules are going to say ultimately.
Sure. Another question that I have is in terms of timeline. When do we expect to hear more from USDA in terms of when it will announce new funding being available to producers, for example?
I know there's going to be a lot of pressure to act quickly, but I also know they have a lot of work to do to decide, where are the needs the greatest, how should they set up a system to make payments? Will it look like last year's MFP in the case of the stuff done with Charter Act Authority? How should the $9.5 billion be allocated? There's a lot of choices have to be made. I'm sure they'll make them as fast as they can, but don't expect check in the next week or two, but I would expect that they're going to try to move as fast as they possibly can.
Right. And how do you recommend that producers stay updated on when they can start to apply for new programming, particularly because USDA is relying on telework now, like a lot of businesses and organizations are, so they can't just walk into their FSA office, for example, and talk to the representatives there?
Sure. I know USDA will continue to put out press releases when there's information. There'll certainly be lots of press coverage of what people expect to happen. But like often occurs, I wouldn't put too much stock in early press stories until something is formally announced. Once there's an announcement, then you can expect that your local FSA office will get the information to people as fast as they can, whether it's by email or whatever. You're certainly correct that with offices closed, one easy way that people had in the past to get information is not there. People have to rely on phone calls or whatever else to get that information today.
Right. Back to another question about the direct payments to families and households. Will that direct payment be based on adjusted gross income from the 2018 tax return?
My understanding is it looks at both 2018 and 2019, and I'm not sure if it's the average of the two or just how it's going to look at those two different years. But my understanding is both of those years are going to be looked at to determine eligibility.
Okay, great. Another question here is asking about whether cattle producers should expect to get any direct payments.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big question marks. Again, if you look at the $9.5 billion, that's allocated to to livestock, dairy, specialty crops, and local food systems. And I think a lot of folks expect that cattle will be part of that. Whether that be done on whether the basis will be, we don't know yet. Just to do some simple math for you all, if you think about what's happened so far, to go back a few slides here, the value of receipts was $68 billion. That's counting both cattle sold feedlots for slaughter, plus the value of feeder cattle that are sold to those feedlots, so double counting, if you will. If you took 68 billion and multiplied that by, say, about a 1/6 decline in prices like we've seen so far, guess what? That ends up being over $10 billion. So if you were going to try to make cattle producers whole, if you will, relative to the 2019 level of receipts, you could spend the entire $9.5 billion just on cattle, which is not going to happen. So I mean, there will definitely be money spent on a variety of different products. So while I do expect cattle producers to get part of that total, how much they're going to get, what the basis will be, that's all still to be determined.
Okay. We have a question coming in via email here about what do you expect in terms of, will there be planting disruptions this spring due to coronavirus?
I know a lot of input suppliers are rushing to make sure they have things in place to make sure that everybody gets the inputs they need this spring. You know, our current expectation, given what we know today, is that we'll probably manage to get most of the crops planted we would have gotten planted this year, you know, provided the weather and everything else cooperates. But certainly the potential for disruption is very much there. You know, if it were to become more difficult to ship things around the country, if it were to become even more difficult than it already is to import products from overseas, you know, some of those supply lines to producers will get to be even tighter than they already are. There may be some cases where there'll be spot shortages of key inputs that could affect our ability to produce crops and to produce livestock in 2020 and the rest of the year. Again, right now, though, we would expect not a big change in the total amount of acres gets planted. We do think that given the sharp drop in ethanol prices that we've seen just these last couple weeks, with the corresponding impacts on the corn market, that we'll probably see a little bit less corn being planted than was previously expected. Doesn't mean it won't be a big number. It will almost certainly be a big increase relative to 2019, when so many acres weren't planted because of the wet conditions last spring. But it may not be quite the levels that people had been anticipating a couple weeks ago.
Okay. We have some questions coming in about the unemployment provisions that are included in the Act, namely self-employed individuals, also those who are independent contractors are now eligible for unemployment benefits, and that's a shift from your typical policy. So what are some examples of independent contractors and self-employed persons who would be eligible for funding now? For instance, are farmers eligible for funding, and what must they prove to receive those benefits?
Right, so again, we don't know yet because we don't have any rules out how it's all going to work at this point yet that I'm aware of. But yes, I think the intention was to make sure that folks like you know, your local Uber driver or somebody like that would be eligible who wouldn't otherwise be eligible for these sorts of benefits. Farmer, I'm guessing, would probably have to be able to demonstrate, you know, something, some inability to conduct normal farming operations, I suspect. But again, I don't know how it's going to play. We're going to have to just watch to see what the rules say.
So back to the direct payments again for families and households. If you haven't yet filed your 2019 return, do you have to file your 2019 return before you're eligible for that direct payment?
Yeah, another good question. I know the answer to. I'm sorry. A lot of these things we don't know yet because we just don't have the rules out there yet. I don't know. Short answer.
Sure. Okay. So how concerned are you about an MFP 3.0 having some sort of WTO implications?
There are definitely things to consider there. You know, how that would be done matters a lot because how it is done would affect how we would notify the WTO of what we've done. There are certain ways you can make payments that are more likely to get you in trouble with WTO than others. You know, in terms of hitting our overall requirements, that we not have more than a certain level of overall distorting support to the farm sector is one thing. It's a different thing, however, to do it in a way that other competing exporters won't decide that we're doing something that is hurting their markets, and therefore they might try to file a case against us. So just lots of questions out there, and it's one of the things I know that USDA is probably struggling with as they try to put together programs to do it in a way that's less likely to cause problems at the WTO than some other options.
Right. Here we have another question about the $9.5 billion allocated to livestock, dairy, specialty crop, local food systems, and so forth. Those funds are USDA allocated, correct?
That's correct.
So if producers that are receiving USDA allocations from this bill, are they also eligible for SBA type programs, like the lending programs, for example?
That's yet another good question. There's nothing that I have seen that would preclude that, but again, we'll see what the rules say.
Okay. Here's a question regarding H-2A workers and coronavirus concerns. Could you speak to whether you anticipate challenges with H-2A workers due to those concerns, and how would that impact production levels, particularly in industries that tend to rely more on H-2A workers?
Right, so there certainly has been a lot of disruption to that program. The inability of people to do interviews, for example, has been a major issue. It is also true that a lot of folks are aware of this issue and are trying to expedite things as best they can, given the circumstances. I will not be surprised if there are fewer workers able to come under that program just because of all the logistical challenges this year. and that will indeed have a potentially large impact on some parts of U.S. agriculture. This is probably far more of an issue for dairy, for vegetables, for fruit, than it would be for a typical row crop or life or cattle producer, let's say, but could be very important for at least some sectors of the economy.
Right. Here we have a question about if any portions of payments will be bound by payment caps like we saw previously with MFP payments.
Again, another unknown. I would not be surprised if there's not something like the MFP caps put in place, but also, again, to my knowledge, it has not been decided yet.
One question that I have is I saw some survey data that agcareers.com published, I think last week it was, and it found that 8% of employees who are working in agriculture said that they had reduced work hours that were tied to coronavirus. Is there any sort of support available to those types of workers who still have a job but maybe aren't earning as much as they had previously?
Yeah, not to my knowledge. Again, maybe there's a piece of the bill that I'm not aware of, but right now I wouldn't know anything that would directly help those individuals.
Okay. Another question is regarding the loan forgiveness programs for small businesses to retain workers. What types of small businesses do we think may apply or may be eligible for those types of funds?
Well, that's one of the questions as well. I mean, for example, we talked about ethanol before. You know, if there was a desire to provide help to ethanol producers, would it be from USDA under a USDA program, or might it be through the Small Business Association? Would they be small enough industries to qualify? Is of course one important question too, since there's a limitation on the size of the company that's eligible for those benefits. Again, we'll have to watch the rules.
Here we have a question about, to what extent do you think that producers are going to be shifting some of their planting decisions because of needing to grow food that people are willing to eat now, for instance, like wheat? You know, we're past wheat planting season at this point, but how might you think the coronavirus response might change planting?
Sure. So of course, winter wheat, of course, was already seeded last fall. Nothing we can do to change that at this point. I guess we might have a little bit less grazed off than we might normally otherwise have had, but that much is pretty much set. Our smaller number of spring wheat acres in the Dakotas, Montana, Minnesota, et cetera, those acres will probably be a little more than we would have otherwise guessed because of what's happened to relative prices recently. Wheat prices have hung in there relatively well. Corn prices especially have fallen off. Soybean prices a little bit as well. So wheat may look like a little bit more attractive option than it was going to previously. So I wouldn't expect a big increase in wheat acres in 2020. In the case of rice, that's another crop where, again, prices have done better than they have for lots of other things. So weather conditions permitting, we might see a few more rice acres planted this spring than were going to be planted before. In terms of the other crops, so again, I think a little bit less corn seems very likely. We'll find out more, of course, tomorrow. We'll get USDA's planting intensive report will be coming out. That, of course, the survey will have been conducted before things got as bad as they are right now. So even that will be, just a preliminary view of things. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if, as often happens, there'll be some distinction between what's in the intentions report and what people actually ultimately plant, even if the weather this spring allows us to plant what we want to plant.
So I suppose that wheat planting intentions could change in the fall, for instance, if we're worried about a coronavirus becoming a problem again. If it recurs essentially in the fall, that could potentially shift some planting intentions. What are your thoughts about that?
Sure, no, it's certainly a possibility. Again, we could see, if we continue to see stronger wheat markets than for some other commodities, that could cause a few more wheat acres to be planted this fall. A lot can happen between now and then, of course, as well. Some of us think that the short run run-up we've seen in wheat prices relative to some other crops, that may prove to be temporary. Global wheat stocks are very, very large. So once people recognize that there's not a shortage of wheat in the world, some of what seems to be panic buying should subside, and I expect that we won't. Seed prices retain the relationship they've had recently for much longer.
Right. One last question for you, Pat. Do you expect there to be any rules governing big and small businesses? For instance, is there a cap on how big your business is and whether you'd be eligible for different sorts of funding?
Yeah, there will be some limitations. If I'm not mistaken, I think the loan to $10 million, I'm sure there'll be a limitation on the size of the business that qualifies. Those SBA loans, and likewise, there'll be some size limitations elsewhere as well in the bill.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Pat, for sharing today's webinar presentation. Thank you to our audience too. When you exit Zoom, you'll have a post-webinar survey that loads in your browser. If you could please consider responding, we'll use your results, or rather the results, to improve the webinar experience, and we'll also use them to brainstorm future webinar topics. Again, you should receive a recorded version of today's webinar via email within a day or so. Our next Engaging for Missouri webinar will take place on Wednesday at 10 a.m. Dr. Sarah Lowe, Associate Professor of Regional Economics and Director of Exceed, Regional Economic and Entrepreneurial Development, will speak about COVID-19's potential impacts on farms and ranches that sell food through local and regional markets. Thank you again for joining us, and have a good afternoon. Thanks, Pat.